And thank you very much, everyone, for your time this afternoon. And again, your time with me for this session. So I'm going to share my slides, and hopefully, like Rowan said, this will be the end to a thought-provoking and an insightful day for you in terms of what part that you have joined. Now, this session is I've titled it Reclaiming Knowledge, Student-Led Approaches to Decolonising Education, because I thought that sounded fancy, and it's a lot simpler than I have put it. My name is Reece Sohdi. I'm a lecturer at the University of Sunderland. I'm a lecturer in teacher training, specifically in the further education and skills sector. But what I just wanted to do, just to start off with, is just give you a bit of context in terms of where I'm coming from, or why I've approached and why I've kind of come into this space in terms of decolonisation, how I've approached it with I call them trainee teachers or apprentices because that's who I teach, but I might use those terms interchangeably and I might mean, and I do mean students, or I might say learners instead. Again, it's just because I've got my head in teacher training. Again, I call them either trainees or I work with apprentices, and I call their students learners, but I'll try and just refer to students. So just a bit of context, because you all might be sat here watching and taking part in this session from a very familiar standpoint. Or maybe your own students or the people around you come in with this viewpoint and come in from this way. So I've just kind of my life in four pictures essentially. So I grew up in London. And I moved to Sunderland when I was 18. So I spent essentially my childhood in London, which was very diverse for me. I come from a very globally diverse family. With my heritage, I have family members from India, from Pakistan, in Malaysia, kind of throughout Asia, basically. And when I was growing up, I remember watching movies, TV shows, looking at the adverts in between TV shows, or looking in magazines, or kind of especially at the start of, or even just in music videos, because that was quite big in the kind of noughties and early tens. And I remember seeing people who didn't look like me in these magazines, in these TV shows, in these movies, who were predominantly white or Eurocentric. And that was my first kind of inkling, I guess, in terms of specifically, I am somehow different to them, and that is a portrayal of whatever they are representing in that movie. And I knew that wasn't real, but it started to have an impact on me. I think it had a massive impact in terms of how I viewed myself, in terms of beauty standards. My viewpoint was, it's not anymore, but my viewpoint was if I didn't look like that, again, how they were portraying it on TV or in movies or in magazines, I wasn't white or Eurocentric, then could I be attractive? Could I be beautiful? Could I find someone? And that really shifted my viewpoint in terms of, again, like I said, in terms of beauty standards, in terms of my own self. And I never really questioned it. I just took it for granted that I looked different, therefore I wouldn't have what everyone else had. Um, and that stayed with me for a while. So I then moved to Sunderland in 2018. So Sunderland in the northeast of England, near Newcastle, if you're not familiar with it. And Sunderland and the northeast quite generally is quite white British. So not it is diverse, but not as diverse compared to what I was used to in London. And my background actually is in performing arts. So I remember, again, I never had anyone who looked like me teach me at university. I never had any real representation in terms of the shows that we watched or the plays at theatre that we were analysing. So again, that really kind of had a sense of how does that impact me? And it did impact me. I then went on to do my teacher training. the year after I graduated my undergraduate degree. And again, but I knew that I would never have students who were in college, who were college age, who really looked like me in the Northeast. And I knew that. But I really thought about how could I possibly expand their viewpoints, their perspective on the world beyond than just Sunderland or beyond the Northeast. So I finished my teacher training and then I did my master's in education because I'm really interested in education. And that's kind of become, I guess, my niche. Um, Getting to where I kind of was when I started lecturing in 2021, like I said, in teacher training in the further education and skills sector and kind of FE, further education. Um, and again, in terms of the cohort that we get at the university, they are quite white British for the most part. I think probably about of the few years that I've been here, I'd probably say about 95% of our trainee teachers have been white British, because we get a lot of students who have gone to Sunderland for their undergraduate, have grown up in Sunderland, gone to Sunderland for their undergraduate, and then thinking about their next steps, and then go on to teacher training. So it's a very small population in terms of ethnic diversity, in terms of the program that I was teaching on. And then finally, again, that push really. So every year for our trainee teachers, we have what we call it a summer conference. It's a celebration of their hard work, but it's also a chance for them, and we put on kind of like CPD-esque workshops around different topics, really, to get them engaged in terms of when they go into their teaching positions. What kind of a teacher will they be, and what could they lead on potentially? So they do sometimes we do sessions in terms of EAL or multi or bilingual pedagogy. We do things on SEND, special educational needs and disabilities, because they might want to specialize in SEND or be a SEND lead. We do things on well-being. And I noticed, and again, I come across this word or this phrase, decolonising the curriculum. I thought, well, it's got curriculum in it, which is a bit of my bread and butter. But what is that decolonising? So I looked into it, and I did a session for them. It was actually really well received. And then I started to fold that into the actual program. So it wasn't something that they did at the end. It was something that we looked at when we looked at curriculum. And then I got to kind of where I am. So I'm a lecturer still, but I'm a program leader for our learning and skills teacher apprenticeship. And my job, and I'm the tutor as well, and my job really is to work with teachers and trainers in the Northeast, but could be nationally, who are in a variety of different teaching or training roles, um, and give them the information, kind of not teach them how to teach because they're already in practice, but really upskill them. And it will really kind of focus this idea of decolonizing the curriculum, but really expanding their viewpoints, expanding what they have been doing in their own organizations. Um, and from that, and where it's got to now at the University of Sunderland, so I'm currently putting together a toolkit, a practical toolkit for staff, and students can view it in terms of how to start decolonising their curriculum. Um, and for students as well, it's a bit of a toolkit in terms of how they could influence the curriculums, the programs, the courses, the subjects they are doing. And that's how I've kind of come to this workshop essentially, which yeah, I'm going to be going through. But I'm going to do a bit of a pop quiz. So it's like 2:45 on a Thursday afternoon. You don't want a pop quiz, but it's a very relaxed pop quiz. So I'm going to go through three questions, and I just want you just for now just to note down the answer of each of them, and then we'll go through each of the questions answer by answer. And I'll just ask you to respond in chat. You don't have to come on mic. Again, if you're not comfortable putting it on chat, please just do the quiz on your own. But if you are comfortable, you can put your answers in the chat in a second. But again, we'll go through all three of them, and then we'll go answer by answer. So, pop quiz, how much do you know? What is the largest human-made structure in the history of Earth? So just note that down for a second. What you think the largest human-made structure is in the history of the Earth. I'll give you a few more seconds. The next question, this one's a bit easier because it's multiple choice. So you've got 1 in 4 of getting it right. What popular drink can be linked to the treatment of malaria? Is it vodka and soda? Is it B, a gin and tonic? Is it C, a rum and coke? Is it D, a whiskey and lemonade? Again, just give you a few more seconds on that one. And then the last one is, what particular type of kitchen cutlery or item had a significant impact on the history of China? So again, just give you a few seconds on that one. Okay, it's not meant to be too hard to test you. And we're going to go through each of the answers one by one. Again, if you feel like you don't know the answer, or don't want to put anything in the chat, please don't feel like you have to. And I also want to say it's also okay to not know or not get it right, because that's the whole point of it. If you got it right, you'd be the first, I would say. Especially for question 1. But yeah, this is a safe space. There's no silly answers, especially in a place where we're all still learning. So question 1, what is the largest human-made structure in the history of the Earth? So again, if you feel comfortable, just put your guess in the chat for me, and just have a go. No one's got this right as of yet, so I'd be very surprised if someone did. So we've got a few people saying the Great Wall of China. We've got the Burj Khalifa. Is it the Suez Canal? Is it the Colossus of Rhodes? Okay, interesting. Okay, so I'll go through the answer. So again, I'm just going to ask for a bit of audience participation. If I just put this picture up, just by yes or no, do we recognize the picture? Do we recognize what it is? Again, just by a Y or N or yes or no. Again, just in case anyone already knows what it is. But yeah, from that picture, I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, it is a no. Okay, brilliant. So this might be what I would call your pub quiz knowledge, where it's a very niche bit of information, but it might win you a pub quiz. So this is the Benin Wall, and it was about 16.8 kilometers in circumference. Now, technically, the Great Wall of China is the longest, but the Benin Wall is the largest in terms of circumference and area covered. And it was built in 1010 AD, and it's known to have been, I said, the largest man-made structure within West Africa, but across history, essentially. And it was located in the old Benin Kingdom. Now, Benin was also one of the first cities to have a semblance of street lighting. Again, it's stereotyped in the media and representations, especially in Africa, and whether it's modern Africa or in history, that Africa is a savage, underdeveloped place, but that's not the case. So they had this essentially street lighting, which were huge lamps, very tall. They were placed around the city, especially near the palace, and they were fueled by palm oil, and the wicks were lit at night to provide illumination to and from the palace. So street lighting. Now you might be thinking, well, I've never heard about this before. What's up with this? Is because the walls were essentially really destroyed and ravaged in 1897 in the punitive expedition. It was led by the British, and it was in retaliation for the so-called kind of Benin massacre, which was the attack on British forces attempting to capture Benin City. So in retaliation, the British, a colonial empire, destroyed, essentially, a small nation. They destroyed the walls. They paved over and destroyed all of this knowledge that was lost. And there are parts that still do exist. If you think about, again, it's very, but again, it doesn't resemble a giant circle at all. It doesn't resemble a wall. It is in fragments, essentially. It's on actually one I would love to visit there and again learn more about the history. if I have the time. So hopefully one day I can. But again, it's an example of, again, what I would call pub knowledge, but actually it's powerful knowledge because it is this information that we have lost. So, second one, if I go back a second, what popular drink can be linked to the treatment of malaria? So again, in the chat, A, B, C, or D. A for vodka and soda, B for gin and tonic, C for rum and coke, D for whiskey and lemonade. This one, a lot more people get the answer right. So I think, judging by the chat, it is a gin and tonic, and I think someone has said the reason why. Okay, good. So Winston Churchill attributed it with saving more Englishmen's lives and minds than all the doctors in the empire. And yes, he was talking about a gin and tonic, but as I think someone in the chat put rightly, it is specifically the quinine. It's not just a gin and tonic; it is the tonic, because that quinine it's an alkaloid, and it's derived from a bark of found in Africa and throughout Asia. Now, in the 1800s, in 1820, there were two French pharmacologists, and they isolated this quinine, and a version was used instead of using the bark, essentially. Now, you might be thinking, hang on, Reece, how does this link to colonialism, decolonisation? Why are we talking about this? It's because quinine, it lowers the mortality rate from malaria, and therefore it enabled Europeans or colonial powers to live in areas where the disease was prevalent. So throughout Asia and Africa, where the temperates allow for mosquitoes, which can spread malaria. And again, it was this idea of indigenous native knowledge being paved over or being used to pave over that said knowledge of when it came from. So again, it's just an example, and I've used this in some of my teaching as well, just to kind of introduce the idea of decolonisation as a pop quiz. And the final one, so again, I'll go back a second. What particular type of kitchen cutlery or item had a significant impact on Chinese history? So again, just have a guess if you wanted to. So just, again, you might get it right. You might get it wrong, but you might learn something, and that's okay. So we've had so far, is it something like chopsticks or a spoon? Okay, I see your logic. Someone's saying, is it a fork? Interesting. So for this one, I skip along. So I'm not going to talk. I'm going to attribute all of these facts also to QI. Massive QI fan, and I'm going to let Stephen Fry do a bit of the talking, and I'm hoping I have actually shared the sound again. I'm going to play it. I'm going to play the video. If you can't hear it, I'll share the sound again. I always forget to share the sound. So hopefully you will be able to hear.
How did the teacup change the course of Chinese history?
So again, did we hear that? Just double checking. Hopefully we did. Yes. Okay, brilliant. So again, the answer he already said. Brilliant. So again, we'll watch.
Did they used to have tea just in their hands like that?
No. They invented it, you might almost say...
You're going to have to invent something for this.
They invented it so early that it was a disadvantage. It held back the course of Chinese history.
When they were building the Great Wall, was everyone going, right, cuppa? Yeah, we'll have a cuppa. To make 5,000 cups of tea, and then, well, the day's over. We've got nothing then.
They did, unlike the Europeans.
Is it because they now, is it something to do with metal and ceramics, or is it because they invented it and they didn't therefore invent other things that would have come before it?
Yeah, that's the point. In our culture, we came to China much later, which we got from them, hence calling it China.
Well, we have bronze.
We also like wine, which they never drank in China. And wine, the colour is very beautiful, and we developed a technology for containing wine, glass. With glass came lens grinding, came telescopes and microscopes. And through spectacles, intellectuals and scientists had an extra 15 to 20 years of reading an active life, and further, all the way through to the invention of medical science. flasks, beakers, retorts, because it's chemically neutral glass, doesn't react to anything that's in it. And the Chinese had no glass made in all of China from the 14th century right up to the 19th century.
And no mirrors either.
And therefore no mirrors. So, in fact, just because they were satisfied with the teacup and didn't bother, this incredibly ingenious race, who would otherwise have invented so many other things, and did invent so many other things, were the one thing they couldn't do. And electronics used glass for valves, and so on.
The irony is, a lot of them prefer coffee.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to pick up on that. So someone said it sounds dubious, so I'm going to pick up on that as well. So actually, and if we share the slides, I've put an article that says actually China did they did drink wine and they did have glass, but more specifically they focused on as well as kind of, like I said, the teacups and ceramics, but they focused more on paper in terms of their living. So in terms of paper lanterns or paper screens, again, in kind of made from bamboo, for example. Now, comparing kind of the histories, so while Europe was in the kind of dark ages where reading and writing was for those who were elite, because nations who kind of favored paper, who favored kind of literature in that way, they were advanced. Actually, they were advancing, as opposed to kind of the Western world that were very dark ages. But the reason I also kind of show those clips, and I do it within my teaching as well, is because I find it gets students to think, like someone said, it sounds dubious, about information, about where information comes from. And a big part of that I will hopefully have a thread throughout this workshop is the idea that a student-led approach is also about helping them to develop their critical thinking. And I have a huge kind of sometimes a big problem with the idea of critical thinking, because sometimes people think it just means what's the good part, what's the bad part. It goes beyond that. It's thinking, especially with a decolonized kind of viewpoint. It's where does this information come from? How does it perpetuate legacies? How does it perpetuate biases? And by doing that, and I found from my own experiences, it's helped students approach this idea of decolonization or decolonizing their knowledge in order to, again, start questioning things. So I think, again, someone else said, yeah, kind of that misinformation or that paving over knowledge, or where did that knowledge come from originally? And again, later on, I've got an example of that we will have a look at. So just moving on a little bit, and I just want to briefly outline, and it's an initial, very pilot stage of the research that I'm doing at the University of Sunderland, is because I've done a focus group with students, again, very initial stage. It was about 10 students in this focus group. And I just wanted to really outline kind of some of the key things that are coming out, because we are seeing it across decolonisation, across universities from a kind of top-down level, kind of approaches in terms of, well, it will help students. It's what we should do at universities. We should be saying that there's not just one way of knowing. There's more out there, and we should be preparing our students for a world in which they can challenge that, in which they can unpick that indigenous, that native knowledge, or that knowledge that's been paved over. And students do want that. And that's something that I found just from my kind of initial starting point that I've been doing in terms of research. And I've just picked out 5 themes, again, that really underpin this session, is the students want that diverse perspective and those voices in their programmes. Within the University of Sunderland, in the focus group, they emphasised predominantly white lecturers and the kind of suppression of ethnic discussions, and diverse discussions, which really limit that kind of global perspective in terms of teaching and them learning. And they really kind of said that some of them felt almost kind of that psychological impact of feeling marginalized from a biased curriculum, or a curriculum that is westernized, or it comes from a colonial point of view, sometimes without even the person who is delivering it realizing. A representation of cultural identity and heritage. So really thinking about students feeling like they belong in the curriculum. And that was something that was highlighted. Some shared experiences of feeling excluded until they came to university, where they encountered lecturers, where they encountered their peers who understood their own backgrounds or who broadened their horizons. So really thinking about universities as that transformative culture for a student and really tapping into it, because again, students do want that. Again, from my focus group, which again I can't generalize, but I can say especially within Sunderland, they do want that. Incorporation of global and diverse perspectives in course content. Again, that idea of some of them saying that it's important to learn about global viewpoints, because I might stay in Sunderland, I might stay in the Northeast, or I might go across the UK, or I might want to go to different parts of the world. Therefore, how is my university program, how is my university course getting me ready for that? And they really wanted that kind of that real life, diverse almost perspective. Again, I've got a huge problem with diversity and inclusion because it's not decolonisation at all. But just for the purposes of today, just to make it a little bit simpler, I am going to use it in its current version of the word of diversity and inclusion. But also, some of the participants highlighted gaps in religious and cultural perspectives within, so for example, in law, looking at family law, looking at things like divorce in terms of different cultures, that's not covered in their program, or they felt they had to include that because it wasn't going to be covered. That enhanced educational experience, a bit of alliteration, through decolonisation. So again, that transformative experience, developing and fostering critical thinking, how to challenge preconceptions as well. Again, how to challenge that murky knowledge where we're not sure where it comes from, and how to address biases. And again, we talk about the issues. And finally, a theme that came up was just indicators of successful decolonisation, which is always hard in terms of how do we know it's been successful, because it's an ongoing thing. Some from the focus group, some of them said, kind of staff and student feedback it could be a start. Some of them were saying how that sense of belonging, about kind of, does it address potential areas of identity crisis? Does it support well-being as well? And think about decolonising well-being. But again, really coming back to that idea of belonging. And again, that's another thread throughout this. A student-centered approach to decolonising, a student-led approach, is about students feeling that they belong in those spaces, in academic spaces, which is really hard, I will admit, but that they can challenge and they have the tools and the power to do so, and that we can enable them to do so as well. And again, I'm not going to go through too much, but just really looking at kind of the monocultures of university. Again, I might have people who are well versed in decolonisation. This is just a refresher. But traditionally, universities really did kind of have this epistemology of the North, the idea, knowledge of the winners. And there's kind of 5 monocultures that I've identified, and there might be more, and I'm happy to have a chat about that, in terms of what universities historically have done. And I've put there as learning for the elite. This idea of really perpetuating knowledge, but one form of knowledge, and in terms of knowledge, historically, science, theology, and philosophy from a colonized viewpoint were taught, and everything else, all other knowledge, was pushed to one side or not worth learning about. Eurocentric knowledge tending to kind of homogenize or marginalize differences among cultures, societies, and worldviews. So really kind of us and them, and pushing that almost. The idea of linear time and scale and productivity, all kind of interwoven as well. The idea of European or Eurocentric or global North epistemology, conceptualizing time as linear and progressive, and where European or Eurocentric or colonial societies were positioned as kind of the apex of human development. And it marginalized, again, that alternative understandings, anything that didn't contribute towards moving forward. If time is and development is an arrow moving forward, everything that didn't contribute that was pushed to one side. Wasn't worth being productive about or thinking about how it can be productive in society. I'm just going to put this this GIF up as well. And as I do, I'm just going to leave it for a second just to kind of circle through. It's just taking a while to load. And again, I've used this briefly, and this is my kind of first, I guess, practical tip in terms of student-led approaches. So within teacher training, and when I deliver it, we do a lot on curriculum. And one of the things that we look at is curriculum across the globe. One of the things that I'm quite excited to start doing, because again, I can't just rewrite my program overnight, because I haven't got the time actually. But it's about doing it in small increments. Is I want to use this map, which shows kind of the colonial powers from the 1400s to 2008, I believe it is, and link that with curriculum and curriculum analysis and curriculum design. And I really want my trainee teachers and my apprentices to pick a colonial power, essentially, that's evidenced on the left. And I want them to follow that through and talk about that in terms of curriculum. In terms of, so from the UK, what is our curriculum like now, where it is mostly teach the test still in schools and in colleges for GCSEs and A-levels. It is very still rote memory, and if you have a really good memory, then you can do really well on an exam. And we're starting to see shifts towards kind of knowledge and sequencing of knowledge, but it is still very teach to the test. And using this map, start to look at where England, the UK, Great Britain colonised, look at their education systems, compare it and contrast those systems, and really think about curriculum in terms of that knowledge, of that colonial knowledge that was pushed, is being pushed, and what can we do about it. And part of my ethos when I am teaching is to give students the space to do that, give them the understanding, give them the tools to do that. And it's not something that they will do just overnight. It's not just a quick assessment that they will do, that they will type. It's something that I want them to really think about as an ongoing project. And when I start introducing it and then take it over 6 months, and I want them to produce something. And I want them also to take that back, especially where I'm working with a lot with apprentices, take that back to their organisations and think about how their organisations are teaching or training, or what knowledge are they perpetuating, what knowledge are they telling their own learners, their own staff members, and start looking at it as a global scale. Again, I've looked at this briefly with some of our students, some of our trainee teachers and apprentices, but it is something that I'm keen to keep doing, and to keep pushing, and to keep saying that it goes beyond than just what I can do and what one person can do, and therefore, we need students to engage, and like I said, they do want to be engaged with it. So this is another thing that I'm going to pose to you and get you to do a little bit on. And what I would like you to do is, in a second, I'd like you to just recreate this. And again, because from what I found, especially from the work that I've been trying to do at the University of Sunderland, is provide a practical toolkit for staff. But really think about decolonisation that goes just beyond race or ethnicity. In my view, it goes beyond that. And from a lot of views that I've been reading, it does go beyond that. So I argue that this idea of colonialism, again, which you might be very familiar with, kind of sits at the bottom. Colonialism is that It's that rope that is put together, that is interwoven, and it's hard to untangle that rope and put it into its separate strands. And what we can start to do is almost fray at those strands. But I argue this idea of colonialism has led to capitalism, the idea of the rich being rich and in power and having a seat at the table, and those who are not rich and who might be poor, struggling to climb that socioeconomic ladder and struggling to have that seat at the table, defined by their finance, defined by their wealth. I argue it's led to the patriarchy. It's led to ideas on if you are male, you have a seat at the table. If you are female, if you are non-binary, if you are trans, for example, you do not have, or historically did not get a seat at the table. Even the idea of gender is not a westernized, newfangled idea. There are many places across the globe where many societies go beyond that binary of male and female. A lot of places in Asia, for example, so places such as India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, in Canada, for example, and parts of North America, indigenous societies who are two-spirit, again, goes beyond that male or female. I argue it's led to racism, issues in ethnicity as well, and which is apparent across the world, I think. Again, at the seat of the table would be those who are white or Eurocentric. And it's led to ableism and a big divide and marginalization of those who are neurodiverse or those who do have additional needs or do have a physical or visual or hearing impairment. And it is, what can we do to first acknowledge that that is the case? And what can we do to understand why that is the case? And what can we do to all this knowledge that has been lost because these people who are at the bottom of these pillars were not included in the conversation? And again, I argue it leads to this idea of elitism and privilege. And it's not to say that someone who is at the top of all those pillars is it's their fault that they have their privilege. It's what they do with that privilege. It's not their fault they are elite. They are a product of a system that has come before them. And what we should be doing in education, essentially, is knocking it down. It'd be great if we could start again, start from ground zero, but we can't, unfortunately. But what we can do in the first instance, and again, this is just something that I would like you just to engage with and just have a go at in the first instance, is I'd like you to draw this is not an art class either, but I'd like you just to draw a version of that diagram, and I'd like you to identify two things. I'm not going to ask you to share either. This is just for yourself. But again, I've done this with my trainee teachers and my apprentices as a talking point as well to get them started on this journey. I'd like you to identify where you are on those pillars. Are you high up on those pillars? Are you lower down on any of those pillars or columns? And on average, where your students that you teach are on those pillars, and that's just an average, or you could just pick one learner in particular, one student, and then kind of connect those lines. So connect all of your dots together as a bit of a dot to dot, and then connect your students' 4 dots together. And just internally reflect. Again, I'm not going to ask anyone to share any thoughts. We're just going to take this for 30 seconds, for a minute, and just think about if you're higher than your students on the pillar, that could be your privilege, or that could be privilege, and differences in the space where we can support and where we can, in a very supportive, inclusive way, provide that space for those marginalized voices in the first instance. So again, I'm just going to ask you 30 seconds, a minute, just to, again, have a little go, and just for your own personal reflection, really. I'm not going to ask anyone to share, even if you do want to. Again, I would like it just to be a kind of an interpersonal thing. So again, just take 30 seconds or a minute. I'm also going to catch up on the chat as well. So I'm just going to pick up on some of the points in the chat there while you do that. I'm also realizing I'm running out of time and I've got so many more slides and I over prepare. Apologies, so I might rush through some bits. And I think that statement where the advent of science in Europe and to suggest that science advancements does not happen anywhere else is madness. Again, I think again that's key, and I think that leads on to the second point about that idea of UK or Eurocentric universities being stuck. Like someone has put there, in kind of an old empire mentality, and therefore those students from the global south think they are going to get a global view, but they don't. And again, from the focus group, I found that it was the students feeling that they had to speak about their experiences. There wasn't a natural way to speak about it. They felt like they were always the add-on, and that's something that I've also spoken about recently with people, especially when it comes to within teacher training, when it comes to supporting learners with additional needs, so whether they have a special educational need or disability, or they speak English as an additional language. Often in training, it's that you do all this about the knowledge about how to assess learners and formatively assess and what summative assessment is, and then SEND and EAL is an add-on rather than it coming from a place where it's fully embedded. And again, it's getting to that point where it's student-led because they feel empowered to do so rather than it's just an add-on essentially, and basically and this as well. It comes from that place. But just drawing back on that task again, it's something that I did myself, and I've got our students and our and my apprentices to do again as a start of the conversation, because from here it really has, and I've had actually apprentices who've then done this with their own colleagues, their own team, taken it back to their institutions, their workplace institutions, and taking a student-led approach in their organizations. They are taking this idea of for example, I have one apprentice who teaches in SEN provision, and he ran with this idea of decolonisation or colonial views, really paving over, downplaying, marginalising learners that he teaches with additional needs and who have SEN disabilities or difficulties. And the knowledge, the curriculum that they were teaching did not support them because it didn't involve them in the first place when they were designing this curriculum. So he's really taken that as his own kind of institutional project where it's student-led. I've supported him and kind of facilitated that conversation, but he's now taking it back and working with his team in terms of just reshaping that curriculum because it doesn't meet the needs of the learners. Because when that curriculum was being designed, again, because of the seats, the people who had a seat at the table, again, from systems that have allowed them to have that seat at the table, it didn't really take into account these learners with additional needs. So again, moving on, and I'm going to skip a few slides just a little bit, just because, again, I'm just very conscious of time. And again, like I said, I always over-prepare. I'm not going to go through this timeline. Again, it's it's an ongoing thing. It's caught a lot of traction in the past few years, especially following Rhodes Must Fall. But it's something that is just now at the forefront of people's view in higher education, and it is trickling into the workplace and across other sectors. So again, I'm not going to talk too much about that. I want to come on to, again, more kind of practical strategies. So thinking about learner-generated content, essentially why you're all here, the title of my presentation, really. So I'm going to use metaphors and analogies, and I do apologise, but when I think about this idea of a student-led approach, and when we think about learner-generated content, it's not just beneficial for our own, because we're always changing, we need to adapt our content for our changing student body, but it's transformative in our educational practices. And it, from my point of view, it positively forces me and challenges me to change the way I teach and to question the knowledge that is in my curriculum, and to really reflect on that And we can imagine our classroom as a kaleidoscope, for example. Those things that you turn and they reveal new colors and patterns. And when students bring that content, they bring forth their unique perspectives, their experiences, their voices, and that just adds to that kaleidoscope. It's just another viewpoint, because all students bring legacy, bring culture, bring heritage. That's not to say that they represent all of their nation. Again, one of the things from a focus group was one student saying, I'm from a small part in Nigeria. It doesn't mean I represent all of Nigeria. Or we can think about it as, I don't know, constellations in the night sky. Each student's contribution becomes a star, essentially, forming connections and narratives that explore and help us understand and expand on the understanding of subject matter. And by embracing this content, again, we can start to decolonize it, and we can start to do it. It might seem as at a slow pace, because again, like I said, I think none of us have the time to completely overhaul what we do, but it's a bit of a slow burn. And one of the first things that I looked at in terms of decolonization was Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So again, just in the chat, just a yes or no. Are we familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Again, just a yes or no, just again in the chat if you feel comfortable. Just so I know how much to talk about it if people aren't as familiar with it. But I'll still give a brief overview. Okay, so we've had a few yeses. Okay, I'll give the Cliff Notes version of it then, just as a refresher, or for anyone who hasn't looked at it for a while. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Abraham Maslow, 1943. The theory, the idea that human needs can be categorized into this hierarchical structure, structure of hierarchy, basically. Each level being kind of, you need your physiological needs, such as, air, water, food, shelter, clothing. Then that means that you can be safe. Once those physiological needs are met and reasonably satisfied, you can be secure, physical safety and psychological safety, leading up to love and belonging, forming friendships and intimacy and love and affection and being social. Then your self-esteem, your esteem for yourself, self-confidence, self-respect, sense of achievement and accomplishment, leading to self-actualization, that idea of personal growth, fulfillment. Arguably, someone studying at a university, that could be them becoming self-actualized. Not in all cases, but that's one viewpoint. So we started to look into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because we look at it when we talk about barriers to learning for students and learners in education. Because it has natural links to barriers to learning. What could be a barrier to learning? It could be their home life could be a barrier, their motivation is a barrier, not having food could be a barrier, for example. Thinking about, kind of breakfast clubs in primary schools. And I started to look at, actually, where did this information come from? How does it actually apply to all, or does it apply to all? And what I came across, and this is just a visual representation, because Maslow never put it in this triangle hierarchy, and neither did this First Nations approach. It's just put into this just as a visual representation. But Maslow kind of took this idea from a Blackfoot tribe in parts in Canada, and an indigenous culture. And it is basically the opposite of what basically Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because for the Blackfoot and a lot of indigenous societies, that notion of hierarchy doesn't align with their understanding of life. And it really, if you think about the phrase, it takes a village to raise an individual. That is really the purpose, where Maslow kind of flipped that on its head and said, essentially, everyone should be out for themselves. And in Blackfoot culture, relationships with the land, animals, ancestors, community members are fundamental to their sense of identity and well-being. So it still links to me looking at barriers to learning. But again, this is where this information has come from. And Blackfoot traditions and values really emphasize spiritual fulfillment, balance with the natural world, but essentially someone is born self-actualized. And again, it takes a village to raise people. Therefore, they don't view things that you need to do X, Y, and Z to get to where you need to be. So decolonising Maslow's hierarchy of needs involved me actually looking at where does that come from? Does that apply to all? Does it apply to the global north, that Eurocentric Western view, or does it not? Or actually, does this knowledge coming from the Blackfoot tribe, this Blackfoot perspective, is that more appropriate? Is that more key and what we should be focusing on? And what I've also looked at, and again, if you're familiar with education and teacher training or apprenticeships, is things like British values. So the 4 British values there are democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, and respect and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs. And I always have a conversation with our trainee teachers and apprentices in terms of what British values are, and quite an open and honest conversation in terms of, do we need the label of British? Do all of these things make a British person or make a British society? But then folding in these 11 Blackfoot values, I'm not going to pronounce them because I will butcher the pronunciation, but you can look there from those 11 values, the idea of prayer, kindness and compassion, respect for others, purpose for being there, what it means to be Blackfoot or what it means to know oneself, taking on tasks independently, being helpful to others. Everything comes in pairs. So kind of, again, a very arbitrary view of kind of, reward and consequence, or action and impact. Everything is given to the person to do with what they want, being aware of an environment and being observant, and to transfer something to others. So like knowledge, trying to transfer knowledge. And what I did, again, thinking about student-led approaches, is we looked at British values, we looked at barriers to learning, we looked at these 11 Blackfoot values, and basically I got my apprentices to do a presentation in terms of that knowledge, but in terms of how does it link to the classroom, how does it link to them as a practitioner, how does it link to them as a teacher or a trainer, what's the impact in their role, what's the impact on their organization? And it was something that it came from them, it was their information, and it's something that I've now been able to fold. So I did that last year with my previous cohort, or with my new cohort of apprentices. We're just coming onto that, looking at barriers to learning, but I'm able to, from a student-led perspective, me facilitating at the start, but I've helped them to expand their knowledge, get them involved because they did want to get involved, but really start to critically think about things like I said, about things like British values, about barriers to learning, about what it means to value something, about what it means to know oneself, as it said there, other things about respect for each other. You have people saying kind of, being able to take on tasks independently. That's not something that's inherently Western, especially for those, especially in the vocation education, where you're helping people to do tasks independently, where they're teaching apprentices themselves, going into the workplace. These values are not just British values, they're not just westernized global values. And I've really wanted to push that idea of giving them responsibility as well to take it upon themselves to expand their horizons. And again, from my viewpoint in terms of apprentices, they then took that back to their workplace as well. So it goes beyond than just the classroom that I am in. Kind of fostering that inclusive environment. And again, like I said, that thread of making students feel like they belong. And that's quite sometimes a really hard one, making students feel like they belong. Now, because of the nature of some of the apprentices and the trainee teachers that I teach, going back to that pillar or those pillars, I have a lot of trainees or apprentices who are, well, a lot of them are white British, but I have quite a lot who have who are neurodiverse or who have additional needs, but also I have a lot who then work in areas of social deprivation. The northeast of England is a huge area of social deprivation. So again, that stems from, again, years in terms of the northeast being predominantly mining and vocational based, and when the mines were shut down, having a huge impact on the local economy. So again, they teach learners who may never go on to university, or who might be the first to go on to university, or who might end up, or who might end up working for their parents. But again, it's about giving them the ideas about what else is out there, and even from an FE standpoint, again, decolonisation started within HE. Let's devolve it to FE as well. How can they support? How do they help their students feel like they belong, and how do I help my students feel like they belong? And one of the things, again, just some other kind of activities that I've looked at, again, you might want to look at how you could adapt, is I've looked at, especially in the UK, I've looked at acts and policies and frameworks to do with neurodiversity, to do with SEND, to do with really, and again, it's quite small on there, but looking at things like the Lunacy Act in 1845, the Idiots Act in 1886, leading to kind of 2012, and then leading to the SEND Code of Practice in 2014. But looking at how the viewpoint and the language and the labels used to describe learners with additional needs, or who are neurodiverse, or who have impairments, really looking at that information, again, who was making the decisions, who was marginalizing these people and these groups, these individuals, and what can we do to support, for example, my learners and my trainees and my apprentices, and how they can support their learners that they are teaching in colleges. I've also looked at, and again, I can't show them because of GDPR, so I can talk about them. We look at just things like communication as well. So British Sign Language is going to start becoming a GCSE in schools. But we've looked at, again, looking at communication, looking at British Sign Language. Decolonising communication involves understanding how colonialism has marginalised and discriminated against those who have verbal difficulties, or who've communicated through non-verbal means. We've done a little bit in terms of finger spelling, in terms of greetings, and from a student-led and a student kind of approach is from these sessions, I've had some of my trainees essentially go out and engage and start to learn British Sign Language, and then come back to a later session that I've delivered with them, and essentially teach the rest of the people what they have been learning. So, but it's about providing that space and making the students feel that they can belong in a space, first of all, and they feel safe enough to practice it, to then go out and really engage with it. And I'm not saying that everyone needed to have gone from my session and learn British Sign Language, but now they have that understanding, now they understand that, could they start again critically thinking about communication? Can they start critically thinking about how to support learners with additional needs, who, again, making that link to kind of colonialism, making that link to the idea that those who were different were marginalized or didn't have a seat at the table? How have they got to where they've got to, where there is little or no support, or the British Sign Language GCSE is just now being kind of introduced in terms of a secondary curriculum? Again, I'm not going too much into this because I am running out of time, and I do apologise. I want to make space for questions and discussions as well. Again, more kind of empowering advocacy. Again, things that I can share, things that I want to do. In terms of collaborative projects, again, students taking ownership of their learning. One of the things that we do is when we do we talk about tackling prejudice and discrimination. It's a collaborative process where trainees and apprentices pick an area of the Equality Act and they do a bit of a presentation and a bit of a micro teach about that, where, again, I give kind of basic information. They take it, they look at the history of that particular protected characteristic in the UK in the first instance, because looking globally, there's just never enough time. I think that's a huge barrier we have to recognise, and then present that back. And again, what's my next question for them is always, what's the impact in terms of their workplace? Again, student-led learning, and student assessment as well, and facilitating that learning through assessment. That taking a bit of a shift away from essays and academic essays, because actually presenting knowledge through storytelling, through presentations, through visual media, it is still rigorous academically, but it just allows that different form of knowledge sharing and knowledge exchange. And then platforms and publications and for presentations. And this is something that I'm working on at the University of Sunderland, when I'm specifically asking from a student point of view, who has made an invisible contribution to the subject that you've teaching. I've just put some examples here because this is how I got them involved and just wanted to put it on their radar. But who has made a contribution to your subject, your degree that you're studying, your course, your program? And why do we not talk about their contributions as much? Because, for example, that psychologist and that person in psychology from the 1920s who did their study on white British males because they were also white and male, how does that impact you as a female from the global south? It doesn't. But actually, it's a way to get them involved. And what I've started to get them to do is write case studies about people who have made those contributions, I said, in their subjects. And I'm planning to turn that into essentially a bit of a publication. I'm wanting to turn it into a teaching resource. So, for example, Mary Seacole. I remember learning about Florence Nightingale in primary school, but I never learned about Mary Seacole. But as a case study, I've got one of the students at the university to write a bit of a case study about her life, what she did, about the challenges that she faced, her accomplishments, and why we should remember her and why she should be spoken about. And I want to turn that into almost a kind of comic book graphic style representation that can be used as teaching material. But again, it comes from a student-led approach because, again, I know that from talking to students, they do want to be involved. And kind of last few slides, really, in terms of the roadmap, and just highlighting a few things. And I might be saying things that you already know. And that's okay, because again, sometimes these things do need to be reiterated, I guess. But just starting with the co-creation of learning intentions, quite often in academia, some of us are regulated by bodies, and so we have very little say in terms of the content or the learning intentions or the learning outcomes, for example. But it's about asking students and asking them to contribute, to define what do they want to achieve as well. And like I said, it might be something that we can't change, actually, because again, our modules, our program learning outcomes are what they are. But within the sessions themselves, what do they want to achieve? What do they want to get out of? Again, and how do we allow them the space to explore that in a safe space? How do we give them the tools to be able to do that in terms of access to knowledge? Or access, or just even helping them to develop that critical thinking, that questioning of knowledge. Where does it come from? Where does it originate? Who is this knowledge really for? Who is this knowledge about? Or who was this research done on? Incorporation of student-selected readings. So again, this is something else that I've started in terms of a book club for my trainees and apprentices. Bring in kind of what have you been reading? What have you been listening to? What have you been watching that brings in perspectives, global perspectives, not just UK perspectives, so that we're not just watching the same documentary, that we're not just reading the same texts. And yes, it's hard to get away from those seminal texts, from those texts in all of our programs where, again, it's an established colonial theory from the 1920s. And again, it's hard to get away from that because we have a regulatory body, for example, who doesn't want to veer away from that. But what can we do to, again, get learners to challenge that reading? Or, again, where was that particular piece of literature? Where was it done? Or who has a different view on that? Again, student design projects or assignments. So on our programs, we've really removed a lot of the academic essays and we're wanting to be more practical based in terms of presenting knowledge, in terms of doing dialogic assessments. One of mine is I want to get them to do a bit of a podcast or a bit of a video presentation, but moving away from kind of essays where arguably, and I'm just being very arbitrary viewpoint, it doesn't represent all, but an essay might really benefit those students that we have where they might not have had to have a part-time job, for example, if they're 18, and they might not have had to have a part-time job when they were 16 and in further education in sixth form or college. Therefore, they could spend more time studying. They might have had access to tutoring outside, which gives them a leg up, essentially. And again, it's not to say that's their fault. Its systems have allowed them to have that privilege, while other people, again, might have needed to work for 16 hours when they were 16 to 18, and therefore couldn't do as much time developing their academic writing. And I think it's a stigma we are breaking, that students come to us and know how to academically write. It's not the case. Facilitation of student-led discussions. Again, it's about, I always say my job is about facilitating those discussions, but just allowing the space. Time, again, is our biggest thing. Sometimes we have an hour with students and we have to get through the information, and there's no time to deviate from that. But even just asynchronously outside of that, what are those questions, those final questions that can be posed as takeaway questions to get that student to think, to critically reflect, to then bring that to the next session, for example. And creation of student-run initiatives or events. Again, it's something that we do on our programs, where when we get them to do research, get them to present it back, get them to, if they have done a very, again, even just decolonising research, so it's not just surveys or questionnaires, but they've done something they're really proud of and they want to share it, well, then they want to share it. So giving them that space. And we hold conferences where students share back their work and their research that they do as part of their teacher training program, essentially. So as my last slide, as I kind of come to the end and my voice slightly starts to run out. So back in 2020, from The Guardian, was a figure that said only a fifth of UK universities said they are decolonising the curriculum, which is about 24 out of 128 asked about reforms to colonial legacies, and are committed to that idea. And I think from speaking to people internally and externally, especially at events like this, there is a growing shift, a growing culture and a shift in terms of we need to do better because, again, as someone's put in the chat before, we owe it to students, but also we should be preparing them for a world beyond the four walls of our universities, or even just locally, regionally, nationally. There's more knowledge out there. And again, my big thing is it also comes down to this idea of sense of belonging and criticality as well. And just to focus on those 3 points there, again, my takeaways, but you also might have different takeaways, and I'd love to hear them as well. But that idea of empowering students through active participation, involving them in creating content, leading discussions, sharing their perspectives. And again, it's not saying that, they're doing all of work, but it's empowering them to take ownership of that learning journey. And I'm not saying that everyone wants to do it. We always get those students who just want to I want to know, I want to pass, I want the information for the assignment. But there are definitely students who want that extra bit, who want to go above and beyond than what's just in front of them. And it not only enhances the understanding of course material and helps us develop course material, but cultivates those critical thinking skills and that responsibility in their education. Fostering kind of inclusivity, amplifying voices is important. Again, incorporating that learner-generated content allows us to showcase those perspectives that have been marginalized or underrepresented or misrepresented in kind of traditional curriculum. And again, there's more knowledge out there, but also understanding that, again, that one learner from a small part of Nigeria does not represent all of Nigeria, but helping students to feel valued and respected, regardless of their background or experiences, and knowing that it's okay to get things wrong, especially in this idea of decolonisation. I've probably got loads of things wrong that you disagree with, but I'm happy to have that conversation and to learn. And finally, integrating learner-generated content can enhance learning outcomes, and it can help, again, in terms of retention, in terms of well-being, like I said, in terms of belonging. But when they're actively creating content, whether it's through research projects or presentations or collaborative assignments, they deepen their understanding and retention of knowledge, because they are doing it themselves. It's not just us who's telling them they need to do this. And by embracing these key takeaways and more maybe that you've taken, again, we can empower students, we can foster that authenticity and that belonging, we can enhance learning outcomes, not only, again, like I said, enrich our teaching practices and what we do, but we can start to chip away and start to fray at that rope. Again, we can never untangle that rope into its strands, but we can start to fray at it and give students the tools and the confidence to critically engage with those perspectives and contribute meaningfully to academic discourse as well, to get started and to challenge. So again, I would just, encourage you to, as you will have been, reflect on, can those principles be applied to your own teaching context? Can you empower students? I'm not saying you don't already, but yeah, how else can you empower students to become active participants in their learning? Can we amplify those invisible voices and those invisible contributions in our curriculum and take it just one at a time? Again, I started with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that took me a good while to find out that information. And there'll be another part that I'll do kind of now and over the summer, and there'll be small parts and pockets of information that I'll start unpicking, in order to, again, create that kind of that educational experience that is decolonized, but again is and can work towards being truly globally representative in any way that it can. So we've got 10 more minutes, and again, I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you very much for listening, for reflecting, for taking part. Again, I know I had to kind of speed up a little bit towards the end there. But I would invite kind of any questions, hopefully not too difficult, any questions, any comments, again, using this space as a learning space for myself as well. If you want to in the chat, or again, if you do want to come on mic, on camera, that's okay. If you don't, again, you can just use the chat. But yeah, just anything that you think you would like to go through, or any comments or questions. I look through the chat as well. How do I welcome dissenting voices a part of the learning and unlearning? So I remember when I started this idea of decolonising at the University of Sunderland, one of the people that I came across said I was really brave for doing it. And I understood why, because I've also been in spaces like this in terms of webinars, in terms of conferences, where people have been quite vocal, where people have been quite angry in terms of the legacies from colonialism. And I'm not saying that anyone can't be angry or can be angry, but I have personally come at it from a point of it's not something that we have to do, which sounds really controversial. And it's not something that I'm pressing on everyone at the university, because they will be annoyed by me the amount of times that I've spoken about it. In terms of kind of those voices, or how I might prevent those voices, I've basically started to just network with who else at the university has been doing work in times of decolonisation. And I would urge you, if you haven't found out who else is doing work, start finding out, because once I started again to find out, I realized that this person over in nursing is doing something, and this person over in sociology is doing something, or this person from I don't know, the from computing is really interested, but is really struggling to do that within their programs. And those are just arbitrary. I'm not saying those are actually the ones. Those are just examples I've just pulled off the top of my head. And it's about, I think, an approach of, again, I'm not mandating. I'm not saying that everyone has to do it, but coming from an approach of, I'm really struggling to answer your question because again, I don't want to. I don't want you to think that I haven't come across them or I have the answer for them. But again, I think it's start finding that network, start finding those people who share similar values. And I think someone's put it out there and they've said, thank you for my humble approach. I think honestly, that's kind of my approach. It is, again, I've not got the right way. It's not just me as well. So I've just started this project on my own, but I also recognize that I can't just do it on my own. Therefore, how do I get other people involved with? So it's not scary, it's not laborious, it's an attack in terms of someone's knowledge. It's not an attack on someone's privilege. It's not an attack on the curriculums that we teach. I'm not attacking anyone. It's coming on it from a place of understanding. I really don't know if I've answered your question. Again, because I can't pretend that I have encountered those voices. But thank you very much. Again, this also helps myself every time someone asks a question or is a comment, because again, it helps. The more I talk about it, the more I understand it myself. Because again, I'm still processing things. Again, got 5 minutes. Any other thoughts just before we do wrap up for this afternoon? What I will say is, just before you do go, again, thank you very much for your time. I will make sure, and I'll send a copy of the slides to Rowan, and I believe Rowan, you might be sharing them as well. If you do want to get in touch, I mean, you can contact me on LinkedIn. That's probably my best bet because I don't have an X. I kind of took myself out of that space. But if you do want to connect with me, I'm trying to push my visibility. Again, find me on LinkedIn and let's continue these conversations. And I'm very keen to, especially as part of this as well, to cross collaborate across universities. That's kind of my next big thing as well, is who else is out there. So it's not just me, it's not just the University of Sunderland, we're all doing it. But no, thank you very much everyone for your time this afternoon. Have a lovely Thursday. And I always end my sessions by saying, do something that excites you. So yeah, do something this Thursday that excites you. So thank you very much everyone.